Section 8, Concluding Remarks.
If you've been following this series since the introduction, you'll know that I've set out 9 videos rather than 8 to be completed, and yes, it's unorthodox to put a conclusion section anywhere but on the very end of a presentation. The purpose of this section, though, is to round off the previous 7 by summarizing some of the salient points and clarifying the overarching messages I've been trying to get across. Section 9 will be devoted to clarifying what Lifeology will be and how exactly it will differ from other courses in science, and clarify my stances on some important questions surrounding the currently ongoing discussions around science and alternative research. This will be a means by which students and parents can determine whether my views align closely enough with their own so that we'd be a good fit for each other, and to provide some hopefully valuable commentary and conversation starters for more general listeners. So let's get on with Section 8. First, remember that everything that has and will be discussed throughout Lifeology, whether it's energy or molecules or cells or ecosystems, are simply models. They're attempts to describe nature, but not necessarily nature as it is. We must therefore be very careful with phrases like "I'm sure," "I know," and "this is true." Although we may use them rather loosely in everyday language, from an epistemological point of view, it may be that we can never use them in any literal or final sense, as it implies there is no way we could be possibly wrong. This again circles us back around to dogmatism. The greatest threat to humanity isn't war or poverty, corrupt government, disease, or unchecked technological development. Rather, it's our inability to critique our own worldviews. Once we find ourselves in such a mental state, we have replaced philosophy with dogma. In Section 4, I offered my working definition of dogma as a paradigm, so in other words, an ontology and an epistemology, that cannot stand to be critiqued or put aside by the individual who holds it. In a sense, it's like being held hostage by an idea rather than an entertainer of one. You'll also recall I said it's perfectly natural to hold paradigms, and as a matter of fact, it would be entirely unhuman and inconceivable to not have any. But true intellectual and spiritual progress requires some degree of flexibility and open-mindedness so that we don't fall into tribalistic and backwards ways of thinking. Dogmatists have a tendency to collectivize with other like minds so as to ensure an ever-loudening echo chamber. And the great thing about ideological collectives is that they'll almost always have some ready-made foil, a diametrically opposed gang which they can direct their emotions towards, temporarily exercising the negative emotion that comes as a result of the shame that they feel for betraying their higher selves. This is the most dangerous of human tendencies, as it arrests our ability to both think creatively and critically, in addition to breaking down communication with different types of people. A society comprised of fragmented idiots will inevitably fail to create any world worth living in. I don't believe it's a controversial statement to claim that the academic world, and the sciences particularly, are going to be populated by individuals who'd score higher on the IQ scale. I say this, of course, at the risk of sounding arrogant, but I need to here in order to make a point. Having a high degree of cognitive reasoning and problem-solving skills would be expected if one is to make it in these fields, considering how abstract and technically demanding they can be. But we often make the mistake of thinking that high intellect is automatically tied to solid objective reasoning and an ability to come to correct conclusions. However, there's a compelling line of argument that seems to indicate that intelligence may at times be detrimental to realistic thinking. It's been reported that people who have a higher IQ tend to be more biased towards their ideological positions, especially when those positions are on polarizing political and social topics like gun control, abortion, gender dynamics, and climate change. This is the case regardless of whether a person leans more conservative or more liberal in their thinking. The argument goes that this is because highly intelligent people are very good at constructing, strengthening, and maintaining models of the world inside their minds. They can rationalize bad ideas extremely well, and since they see themselves as highly intelligent, they become dismissive when someone presents them with counterarguments. In their minds, there is simply no way that someone from an opposing team could ever outlogic them. This characteristic actually has some evolutionary benefit. Humans are social creatures, and if we're able to rationalize belief structures that help us to congeal with our in-groups or construct arguments that provide us with some level of influence within those groups, then we're afforded safety, security, and potentially power. Apply this to the rise and continuation of the many outlandish superstitions and religious frameworks that have existed throughout time. On an individual survival level as well, uncertainty would be coupled with vulnerability and insecurity, a veritable death sentence for ancient humans whose daily lives at some point in our evolutionary history would have been spent constantly walking a fine line between life and death. This might also help to explain the deeply rooted fear that people have towards being wrong. Although in the modern day, making a mistake doesn't necessarily mean eating a poisonous fruit, falling off a cliff, or getting run down by a pack of wolves, the instinct itself is nearly impossible to extricate, especially for those who spend little to no time in introspection. And so, from this perspective, the proclivity folks have towards insisting on the correctness of their beliefs stems from unconscious emotional roots growing from a soil of insecurity and fear. Unfortunately, this has negative ramifications for society at large, since it means the people who are adept at deluding both themselves and others tend to be the ones who obtain positions of social influence, such as in politics, academia, media, and entertainment, where jockeying for positions in a hierarchy is how one makes a career for themselves. Their skewed worldviews can then be used to influence policy decisions that lead us all into systems that become further and further divorced from rationality. For them, this is fine. Their beliefs don't need to be true. They just need to be argued well enough to convince themselves and other, less intelligent people than them of their validity. In this way, some of the most intelligent people alive may in practice be repulsed by truth, despite their outward claims that they, quote, know what it is, and that they're, quote, fighting for it. Instead, they're merely fighting for their truth. Or, better said, they care more about being right than they do about truth. We can lean once again on the COVID example. Some of the most intelligent and well-educated people were the ones who wholesale backed the COVID narrative and advocated for the experimental vaccines, insisting that they were indeed safe and effective, despite a lack of reasonable evidence that this was the case. On the other hand, some relatively low IQ individuals, such as religious dogmatists, staunchly refused to take any of the injections despite not really having much understanding of biology or medical science at all. For them, the injections were simply evil, and their decisions to not partake really boiled down to a sort of collectivism. Their leaders and peers weren't getting them, so neither were they. But which of these two groups has ended up being vindicated after the dust has settled? This is more than just an admonishment of the scientific community. It's a warning for everyone, no matter what their belief system is. It appears that the more intelligent we are, the more likely we are to fall into the self-set trap of cognitive bias. This line of argument is explored beautifully by the YouTube channel called After School in a 15-minute video titled, Why Smart People Believe Stupid Things, from which this slide was first inspired. Pretty much everything I've said here is a distillation of what the author expressed in that video. As such, I would go so far as to label this video as required supplemental viewing for Lifeology, so I've included a link in the description of this video for you all to have a watch. So I'll finish up this slide with what he says is the best way to avoid this aforementioned way of thinking, since I'm very much inclined to agree. Rather than constructing your identity around being correct in your views, you should instead try to build your identity around being willing to learn and integrate new information. And I believe the French philosopher Henri Bergson summarized well the tendency towards cognitive bias when he wrote, "The eye sees only what the mind is prepared to comprehend." Regardless of one's intelligence, there are always limits to our knowledge. But far too often, people mistake their own personal intellectual limits as approximating universal limits, and become pompous and close-minded as a result. And a helpful tidbit from Milton Friedman: you cannot be sure that you are right unless you understand the arguments against your views better than your opponents do. Simple, yet profound advice that most seem all too keen to skip over. Another creator of the internet expressed it quite well when he made this little 4-paneled comic strip. For the benefit of those of you who are only listening, it's a conversation between two characters, where in the first panel, one of them states, "I have strong opinions," The second character in the next panel responds, "Are they based on reality?" Character 1 then comes back with, "They're based upon how I feel in my heart." And then the final panel shows an anthropomorphic heart proclaiming, "I'm terrified that if I research and form opinions based on reality, a wedge will be driven between me and my community, and I will lose my friends and family." The end. What I like so much about this is that, unlike the vast majority of meme content we find online, this one isn't taking any particular side, but rather is calling out people of all ideological camps and forcing us to wrestle with this tendency within ourselves. I'm willing to bet that this underlying fear plays a role in everyone's formation of opinions to at least some degree. And that includes mine. So, something to watch out for, guys. In Section 4, we touched on this word empiricism, referencing it as an important philosophical foundation on which science is based. Once again, it states that we know reality, i.e., we determine ontology, by way of our bodily senses, what we see, smell, hear, taste, and touch. This stands in opposition to rationalism, which holds that we determine reality through logic, due to the assumption that our senses can't be relied upon to give us a fully truthful assessment. This dichotomy of ideas actually pretty well summarizes a good majority of the Western philosophical conversation throughout time. Science will often state that it relies on empirical data, meaning objective measurements. Examples used in Section 2, if you recall, were the physical health indicators like size, color, etc. of the cabbages, and the average height measurements of the Asian elephants. These metrics could also include things like velocity and momentum when studying movement of large objects, or current and voltage when studying electrical systems. There are plenty of other variables that I'm sure you all could imagine. But in Section 4, I stated my position that positivism is the actual epistemological foundation of modern science, not empiricism. Just remember that positivism is empiricism, with the addition of filtering our sense experiences through the scientific method. That is, using empirical data to run observational and experimental studies. So while the two aren't exactly synonymous, they're very much intertwined and thus easily conflated. But there are some issues with the claim that data within the sciences is solely empirical. When I first introduced these concepts in Section 4, I breezed over an important point so as to not derail what I was trying to say at the time. That point was that measurements and models of things that we can't directly experience with our senses are now treated as empirical, which is highly problematic. Two fields of science that are most representative of this issue are physics and chemistry. So briefly, chemistry is the field of science related to activity and interactions between atoms and molecules, which can be thought of as tiny objects that are constituted of two or more atoms bonded together. Anything below this level is considered to be within the realm of physics, the branch that focuses on the underlying physical mechanics, hence the name, of the reality we find ourselves in. This includes singular atoms, or atomic physics, atomic nuclei, the realm of nuclear physics, and even smaller particles that these atoms are said to be constructed of, which is where you get particle physics. The issue is that these fields assume the existence of these particles, atoms, and molecules, despite the fact that no one, to my knowledge, has ever directly observed them with any of their naked senses. What we have instead are visual models to give us an understanding of what they look like, and mathematical models to tell us how they behave. Even the images provided by Erwin Mueller that were shown in Section 5 were only obtained through the use of a machine. All we can really see when we, for example, observe a chemical reaction is what's happening to the materials. Maybe a change in color or the creation of some bubbles. Maybe it creates a new smell or gives off some heat. Whatever it is, these physical sensations are really the only data that can be taken as empirical. Any further analysis of what's happening to the atoms and molecules themselves, or that they even exist in the first place, is reliant on models that have been constructed for the purpose of making predictions. But the vast majority of scientists and the general public make the mistake of, and say it with me, mistaking the map for the territory. And it could very well be that chemical bonds work as described, or that a nucleus does truly exist as a conglomerate of neutrons and protons. No one can count any of this out completely, and I think we can all admit that they are at least effective in making predictions. And we can learn all about them together if you decide to enroll in my course and we make it to the physics and chemistry modules. I bring this up, though, to drive home the point that science so often oversteps itself by assuming its models are objectively true, and that it will disingenuously present such ideas as empirical when they simply aren't by definition. There's also the issue that empirical data can only be truly empirical when we ourselves have observed it. Otherwise, we're just taking claims of an empirical reality on faith. Let's say you're learning archaeology and you've just read a claim that an ancient town has just been excavated and they found evidence that the town had been wiped out by Mongols during the reign of Genghis Khan's empire because they found remnants of arrows that matched the design other historians and archaeologists had already determined the Mongols had used. All good. This very well could be the case. But until you're actually there on site and observing the artifact yourself, these claims are not empirical to you. It's secondary data that you choose to accept or not accept. All this is to say, empirical data is a lot more subjective than we're led to believe. But remember, we also landed on constructive empiricism as a pretty solid framework for assessing scientific information, landing somewhere in the middle of scientific realism and anti-realism. This framework, I do believe, is extremely useful because it takes note of these limitations and acknowledges those of our perceptions, but it doesn't fall into the habit of radical skepticism and dismissal of any observed data merely on these grounds. Scientific research is useful, it would say, but not to be mistaken for an absolutely objective reality. This leads naturally to the next message I'd like to leave you all with. Science is a faith-based system. This is a statement that I've personally seen get under the skin of many institutional minds. Their response, how could that be? Science is based on findings that are replicable or repeatable. However, what they fail to acknowledge is that every study they choose to believe in without replicating themselves is an act of faith. In a sense, they have faith that the findings are replicable. This all boils down once again to the salient purpose of this entire module, to analyze basic epistemology, ask the question of how we know what we think we know. We return again to Max Planck, who stated, "Anybody who has been seriously engaged in scientific work of any kind realizes that over the entrance to the gates of the temple of science are written the words, 'Ye must have faith.'" But personally, when I think of the source that illuminated this realization to me in all its clarity, is none other than the 10th episode of Season 8 of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. As a matter of fact, this entire module is really just an expanded revisioning of a video essay I made back in 2021 before Lifeology was even conceptualized, titled The Epistemology of Ronald MacDonald, The Eternal Search for Truth, which used the same clip that we're about to watch as its basis. It can still be found on my channel and can serve as an abridged version of this module if you're interested in checking it out. And before I play it, for those of you who might find a bit of light cursing distasteful, I recommend you skip ahead 4 minutes and 22 seconds from here. Let's play.
I'm finished, guys. I'm finished. Now, this is all about making myself credible in your eyes again, and I'm going to do that by admitting that evolution is a lie!
You, Mac?
Yes, please do, Mac. Now, as you can see, this is the evolution meter, and I've put God, the creator of everything, on the right side, and evolution on the left. I've went ahead and put you guys all on the fence, because of course you're going to hear out my
Actually, no. Let's start where I would start.
No matter, I'm righteous. I'm not going to stand here, present some egghead scientific argument based on fact. I'm just a regular dude. I like to drink beer, you know? I love my family. Rock, flag, and eagle, right, Charlie? He's got a point. No, he doesn't. What? See, Charlie? These liberals are trying to assassinate my character. And I can't change their mind. I won't change my mind, because I don't have to. Because I'm an American. I won't change my mind on anything, regardless of the facts that are set out before me. I'm dug in, and I'll never change.
Mac, look, you're wasting our time. You're not going to get us to not believe in evolution.
And why is that?
Because the smartest scientists in the entire world all agree that it's real.
I'm glad you brought that up. Because, Mr. Reynolds, science is a liar sometimes.
Oh, boy.
This is Aristotle, thought to be the smartest man on the planet. He believed that the Earth was the center of the universe, and everybody believed him because he was so smart. Until another smartest guy came around, Galileo, and he disproved that theory, making Aristotle and everybody else on Earth look like a bitch. Of course, Galileo then thought comets were an optical illusion, and there's no way that the moon could cause the ocean's tides. Everybody believed that because he was so smart. He was also wrong, making him and everyone else on Earth look like a bitch again. And then, best of all, Sir Isaac Newton gets born and blows everybody's nips off with his big brains. Of course, he also thought he could turn metal into gold and died eating mercury, making him yet another stupid bitch. Are you seeing a pattern?
No.
Mr. Reynolds, these were all the smartest scientists on the planet. Only problem is, they kept being wrong. Sometimes.
This is insane, you fool!
I'm a fool because I have more faith in the saints that wrote the Bible?
Yeah, because you just read the words of a bunch of guys that you never met, and you just take it on faith that everything they wrote was true.
And what makes you think what your scientists are writing is any more truer than my saints?
Because there are volumes of proven data, numbers, figures. There are fossil records.
Oh, fossil records. Ah! I didn't even think about the fossil records. I guess I'll concede. Oh, wait, one more thing before I do, Mr. Reynolds. Have you seen these fossil records?
Have I? Huh?
Have you poured through the data yourself? The numbers, the figures?
Well, no. No.
Oh, interesting. So let me get this straight, Mr. Reynolds. You get your information from a book written by men you've never met, and you take their words as truth based on a willingness to believe, a desire to accept, a leap of, dare I say it, faith?
Come on. Look, I don't even know how I'm supposed to respond to that. Come on. That's a false equivalency.
Just answer the question, Mr. Reynolds.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
I rest my case.
Oh, that got me. Yeah. Frank, do you want me to?
Let me go.
Yeah, all right. What? Well, we're going on the fence. I mean, it's a shadow of a doubt.
You actually don't believe in evolution anymore?
I don't know. He created a reasonable doubt. He makes you sound like a stupid science bitch.
Yeah, that's good.
Oh, my God.
Sometimes it's comedy that most easily gets through where somber philosophizing can't. And in case this needs to be made clear, I am not here defending any position taken in this video. Mac points out an obvious flaw in Dennis's blind faith in scientific canon, but that doesn't make his own blind faith in the Bible any better. The value of his argument is that it simply places the two on equal footing. To summarize, from American economist Thomas Sowell, some things are believed because they're demonstrably true, but many other things are believed simply because they have been asserted repeatedly, and repetition has been accepted as a substitute for evidence. A method of argumentation, or rather non-argumentation, that's employed again and again by the scientismists is what philosopher Ayn Rand referred to as the argument from intimidation. She defines this as a fallacy that bypasses rational argument by means of psychological pressure, where the user of the strategy makes the claim that some position with which they're arguing against can only be taken up if its proponents lack some essential characteristic, such as morality, intellect, empathy, etc. The example she gives in her 1964 book, The Virtue of Selfishness, goes, "Only the immoral can fail to see that candidate X's argument is false." And we can see the same strategy playing out in today's arena with statements along the lines of, "Only the uneducated question vaccines," "Only hateful bigots are unsupportive of transgenderism," and "Only racists support nationalism." Although not exactly the same thing, comparisons can be drawn between this and the more well-known ad hominem fallacy, where the speaker again bypasses an argument by attacking their opponent's character or motives directly. The difference is that the former is more veiled and passive, but the result is still the same. How often as well these words are accompanied by an air of arrogance, a dismissive tone, and assumed intellectual superiority.
Most can recognize this tactic and will understand to varying degrees its weakness. But now, if you didn't already, you have a name and a reference for it. So no need to be intimidated by arguments from Intimidation, guys.
Before you decide whether or not to put your trust in a scientific claim, it's recommended that it pass through a series of considerations first. 1. Who ran the study, and what are their biases and motivations? 2. Who funded the study, and what are their biases and motivations? 3. Has the claim taken all possible variables into consideration, and can you be certain that they were all controlled for properly? 4. Was the data collected honestly, correctly, and consistently? 5. Was the data analyzed honestly, correctly, and consistently? 6. Did you go through the data and analyses yourself to check the work? 7. Did the authors interpret the findings in a way that makes sense? 8. Did you learn the claim from primary literature or from a secondary source like teachers, a textbook, the news, social media, etc.? 9. If the latter, are you sure that the representations you got accurately reflected the primary findings? 10. Are there others who understand the research in question who have voiced objections to the claims? And if so, have you familiarized yourself with their arguments? 11. Are you sure that our 5 empirical senses and/or our measurement tools provide us with an absolute one-to-one reading of reality? And number 12. Have you yourself replicated the study? With all these inquiries honestly addressed, we can then say with far greater precision just how much faith we can put into the conclusions of any given scientific claim. Not doing so leaves one open to an eventual humbling when they encounter someone who has taken their epistemology seriously. And if you've now made it this far, I have to assume that someone will be you. If and when you do find yourself in conversation with one of these dogmatists of scientism, remember these questions, pose them to that person, and I would be very surprised if they don't give them major pause and show them for fools. By bringing to bear what we've learned throughout this module, we can honestly acknowledge the fragility of scientific claims and remain open to altering our views as necessary when better evidence and argumentation present themselves to us. I'll end this section with a few more wise words from great thinkers of the past. The first from Douglas Adams, renowned author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. In Volume 4 of this series, a scientist named Wonko the Sane remarks to the main character Arthur Dent that a scientist must be absolutely like a child. If he sees a thing, he must say that he sees it whether it was what he thought he was going to see or it wasn't. See first, think later, then test. But always see first, otherwise you'll only see what you were expecting. Most scientists forget that. I'll show you something to demonstrate that later. So the other reason I call myself Wonko the Sane is that people will think that I'm a fool. That allows me to see what I see when I see it. You can't possibly be a scientist if you mind people thinking you're a fool. This encapsulates what it truly means to pursue truth honestly and openly. Many fear to consider certain possibilities out of fear that they will be seen as mad by their peers. They would rather conform to otherwise ridiculous perspectives than to be the one who, to borrow an old metaphor, remark that the king is without clothes. For more evidence on this, I would direct you to the Asch experiments of the 1950s as well as the Stanford prison experiment of 1971. Links can be found in the description below. And finally, from a man who is often put up as one of the premier poster children of scientific materialism, Carl Sagan himself, who wrote in his 1995 book, The Demon-Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. One of the saddest lessons of history is this. If we've been bamboozled long enough, we tend to reject any evidence of the bamboozle. We're no longer interested in finding out the truth. The bamboozle has captured us. It's simply too painful to acknowledge, even to ourselves, that we've been taken. Once you give a charlatan power over you, you almost never get it back. This well-intentioned book was aimed at convincing readers to engage in rational skepticism and the scientific method rather than give their minds over to superstitious laziness. But despite Sagan's hero status amongst most in the scientific community, it seems that they have, in their arrogance, given themselves over to the same patterns that they were meant to guard against. So I'll end this one here. Stay tuned for the final section.